Africa is a geopolitical battleground, not a sideshow. Africa is not a sideshow to world politics. It is one of the main arenas where the next global order is being negotiated, tested, and in places imposed. The reason is not mysterious, it is material. Minerals that sit beneath African soil increasingly sit beneath the world's strategic future. That is why the language of partnership often masks something older. Competition for access, competition for leverage, competition for alignment. A new scramble for Africa, but one conducted through finance, security cooperation, infrastructure, and information systems rather than flags and gunboats. And yet the logic rhymes. In the 1880s, the Berlin Conference did not merely reflect European values. It formalised a mentality. Africa could be organised from outside, for outside priorities under outside rules. The conference helped codify effective occupation as a principle, alongside frameworks that facilitated European claims and reduced rivalry amongst the claimants. The General Act itself was framed in the language of trade and civilization, which is precisely how extraction learns to sound like a virtue. The parallel today is not a single conference's carving borders. It is that external powers still approach Africa as a strategic place to be organized, stabilized, or leveraged, often with limited patience for African sovereignty when it interferes and with its own external goals. The table has changed, the instincts have not. China's engagement is the most visible example of how the new competition works. It is heavy on infrastructure, energy, transport, telecommunications, and finance. According to the Boston University Global Development Policies Research Chinese Loans to Africa database, between 2000 and 2023, Chinese lenders provided over 1,000 loans, totaling well over $100 billion, with major concentration in energy and transport. That major scale matters, not because it proves benevolence or predation, but because it creates systems. Roads determine trade patterns. Ports determine logistics. Digital infrastructures shape sovereignty. The more interesting shift now is the easy phase of lending is fading. Recent reporting based upon a One Data report described a change in net flows, with the new Chinese lending slowing sharply while repayments rose, producing net outflows from many African countries to China in recent years. This does not prove a single story, but it does sharpen a question that African governments and public have a right to ask. When debt service grows and policy space shrinks, who holds the leverage and who pays the political price? The United States, by contrast, often acts as if Africa is simultaneously important and peripheral. It is important enough for speeches, summits, and strategic documents, but often too peripheral when it comes to sustained economic statecraft. This creates a vacuum that Washington then tries to fill with security cooperation, warnings about rivals, or episodic initiatives. That pattern communicates something African policymakers understand instantly. Attention is conditional and can be withdrawn quickly when domestic politics in Washington shift. Russia plays a different game. It has fewer economic tools, so it turns to influence that is cheaper, deniable, and in many cases destabilizing. The political think tank RAND has documented how Russian mercenary and paramilitary groups have proliferated in Africa, describing them as a mechanism to expand Russia's footprint and influence at a relatively low cost. Reporting on the ground has tracked how Wagner's footprint has evolved into a more formal structure under the Russian Defense Ministry, with Russia's African Corps positioned to maintain Moscow's presence even when Wagner's brand becomes too toxic or too chaotic. This matters because it reveals the new style of sphere influencing. Not colonial administration, but security dependency. not governors but trainers, contracts, and political protection. Where institutions are weak and insurgencies are real, this offer can be tempting. But it comes with a familiar price: reduced sovereignty, heightened repression, and long-term fragility. It also fits a broader regional story in the Sahel, with coups and military takeovers since 2020, reshaping diplomatic alignments, with juntas often citing insecurity and corruption while recalibrating away from Western partners. Recent events in Burkina Faso include the dissolution of political parties by the military government, underlining how quickly sovereignty can slide into domestic authoritarian consolidation. Then there are Britain and France, whose influence has never truly disappeared, not because they still rule, but because they still have the durable architecture built a century ago. Language, law, education systems, elite networks, military doctrine, and the inherited administrative habits of the state. France in particular remains bound up with debates over monetary sovereignty through the CFA franc system, which critics described as a lingering channel of external influence, and which countries to provoke political contention, including public debate in parts of the Sahel about leaving the CFA zone. Even when the technical economics are complex, the symbolism is not. Currency is sovereign, and in the public mind, and symbolism moves politics. So yes, Africa is a geopolitical battleground, but the most important point, and the point too often flattened by outside commentary, is that Africa is not simply acted upon. African states and societies have agency. They hedge, bargain, play rivals against each other, and pursue their own interests, sometimes with skill, sometimes with corruption, sometimes with tragic short-termism. Agency is real, but is exercised with constraints, debt burdens, fragmented markets, security threats, and the inherited weakness of institutions shaped by colonial extraction. This is where the resources question becomes decisive. The content's mineral endowment should be a platform for industrial development, but too often this is an invitation to repeat the old pattern. Export raw materials, import finished value, retain the environmental cost, and see too little of the wealth translate into public goods. UN-linked analysis has argued that Africa captures only a fraction of its potential revenue from its mineral resources. The IEA has pushed the idea of a value train upgrading, moving from extraction to processing and manufacturing where feasible, because this is where jobs, skills, and resilience are built. A pro-African position does not require romancing African governments or pretending every internal problem is externally caused. It requires clarity about incentives. External powers are not coming because they discovered a moral calling. They are coming because Africa matters to their industries, their security, their prestige, and their strategic competition. The question, then, is not whether Africa should engage. It must. The question is whether Africa can engage on better terms. This is where Pan-Africanism stops being poetry and becomes strategy. The single greatest weakness external powers exploit is fragmentation. 54 states negotiating separately are easy to pressure, easier to divide, and easier to lock into asymmetric contracts. Continental bargaining changes that dynamic. The African Continental Free Trade Area is one of the most significant projects in this direction, aiming to connect a market of around 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP measured in trillions to deepen intra-African trade over time. The point is not that AfCFTA will magically fix everything. The point is that it is an attempt to build the leverage that comes from scale. Pan-Africanism is at best. It is not anti-West or anti-East, it is pro-Africa. It is a demand that African development be measured not by ribbon cutting and GDP graphs, but by sovereignty that is real, industry that is local, and prosperity that reaches ordinary households. It also is a demand for seriousness from African elites, transparency in contracts, value addition targets, environmental protection, and an insistence that national interest is not the same as regime survival. Here is the uncomfortable parallel with the 1880s. Back then, European powers claimed they were bringing order while they extracted wealth. Today, external powers claim they are bringing partnership while they secure resources and alignment. The language has modernized. The motive force remains recognizable. But there is a crucial difference. Africa today has institutions, sovereign governments, regional blocs, and a rising educated population, and growing public scrutiny powered by media and technology. The continent is not condemned to repay its past. It can negotiate its place in the world. The hard truth is that Africa will be courted by everyone and protected by no one. That is the nature of the system. The opportunity is that competition can be turned into leverage if Africans insist upon it. Through the scarlet lens, the conclusion is simple. Africa is not a battleground because others say so. It is a battleground because the world's future runs through Africa. Through African land, African labour, African ports, African votes, and African minerals. The only question that matters is whether Africa is positioned to win more from that reality than it loses.